Hey everyone, Pastor George here with today's Theolog, and just wanted to let you guys know out front that this one is not for kids due to the subject material and my dealing with it. Because I think any way to really talk about this in a way that's meaningful for people, you gotta actually talk about what happened. So if you're around or it might be sensitive, this might not be a good time to listen to this video, but if not, go ahead and watch on. Also, because we are going to be talking about the Jeffrey Dahmer show, there are going to be spoilers. So if that's something that you're worried about or whatever, go ahead and skip it as well. And more lightheartedly, I am not being sponsored by Reese's Puffs. The food pantry got a lot of these like bat-shaped ones. It's spooky and it's for Halloween, so until I move it to my apartment, it's a good background for Halloween scary themed videos like this one. So anyway, this video is partially a review of the Jeffrey Dahmer show on Netflix, which I've watched over the past week, and kind of the religious implications of it. Because if you know anything about Jeffrey Dahmer, religion actually ends up playing a kind of interesting role, and it also plays an interesting role in the show. So, firstly, this show is about Jeffrey Dahmer, who was a serial killer in the late 1980s and early 1990s until he was caught. And we'll talk a little bit more about what he did later. But this show chronicles kind of his life story. And as a production, it's very well done. The cinematography is good. The acting is very good. I can't remember the name of the guy who plays Jeffrey Dahmer, but he plays Quicksilver in the new X-Men movies, and he's really good in that. And he clearly has some good talent in his ability to move outside of his normal range. And so I was really impressed with that. I think that one of the things that we could look at that this series does interestingly is and where it kind of fails even is how it presents the history of the time, because in some senses it feels very like they put a lot of effort into making sure that this movie looked and felt like the late 1980s and the early 1990s, and the way that everyone's dressed and stuff like that. But at the same time, it's very much a product of modern America as well, because there are kind of three main themes that run throughout this piece. The first, and the one that they probably hit on the most, is the racial element. And it's interesting at first when I first saw it, because that is not something that, as someone who's kind of familiar and have read stuff about Jeffrey Dahmer before, not something that's usually talked about, right? The fact that most of his victims were black, and that is not a lot of the focus when Jeffrey Dahmer is brought up. And this movie really, this show really hammers that home, and uses that as a big thrust of its messaging. Now, that ends up, while a very interesting premise, ends up kind of falling flat, because they end up overstating their case and changing the history in order to make that a bigger deal. Like, they change the race of some characters, they add in false things that never really happened, to make it look as though it's more of a racially motivated thing than it really was. And I think that ends up really harming the product, because it ends up not giving us very good history. And that's actually why I didn't end up liking the show that much. I actually thought that was an intriguing thing to do, because I'd never thought about that aspect before. But it's one of those things where if it was subtle, could have been done really well, but it ended up not being very subtle at all. The second main thread that runs through the show is LGBT stuff, or really the gay community, because the director and writer for some of the episodes of this show, but he was the writer for most of it, and he has a collection on Netflix, I believe, is gay himself, and so he focuses on that because that's a part of Jeffrey Dahmer, right? Is that he was a guy who identified as homosexual, clearly struggled with sexuality in his life, and also targeted gay men, right? And I actually think this show does a good job of showing that, like, in the late 1880s, there I go again, 1980s, and not early, everything before I was born was just a long time ago, all right? I'm sorry. So late 1980s, early 1990s, there wasn't a lot of care for that community, and so the police definitely fail to protect them or don't care as much about that. And I think they do a much better job showing that in the show because it's much more true to what actually happened with Jeffrey Dahmer. And so I think that was a fairly good element of it, and an interesting way of trying to bring the story around and talk about it from that angle. And the last angle that they do is faith, which is really interesting, but not all that surprising because Jeffrey Dahmer at the end of his life became a born-again Christian, and that's depicted in the show. And it also is a running theme throughout because he lives with his grandmother for a little while he is doing terrible things and killing people, just to kind of sum it up. And she tries to get him to go to church with her, and he does sometimes, but he eventually, says he's an atheist and stuff like that. And it's a really interesting running theme between with religion, and that really comes to a head in the final episode, which I'll talk about in a bit. But I just want to give my thoughts overall. And so, generally, I thought the show was really good in some ways, but also really bad in others, which gave me a really middling view of it. Like, I can't get over the changing of the history in order to fit what I would say is a very modern American view of race relations and the agenda that usually follows talking about that type of thing. I found it very annoying, and I think they could have said exactly what they wanted to say, but I think they were just trying to win political points and things like that. So that really soured my thing, because it ends up that when people watch this is what they're going to think the history was like, and then it's only going to undercut their point when people actually find out and they go, well, actually, I just think that this is all a lie now, right? So I think that's really important, but I also like the aspects of it, because like, even though it was a little kind of weird at the end with the religious stuff, I think that they're good that they're talking about that rather than just sweeping it under the rug. So, all right, so that's my general view. Now I want to talk about the religious aspect of it, because in the final episode of the show, there's spoilers, so I already said that, but in the final episode of the show, it contrasts Jeffrey Dahmer with John Wayne Gacy, who was another prolific serial killer in the 1970s. And John Wayne Gacy always swore that he never did anything, right? That was all planted, that he didn't kill anyone, that he was innocent, that he goes to confession, that he talks with God. God knows he's innocent, and when he goes to heaven, he's gonna be proven. When he dies, he's gonna be proven right? And Jeffrey Dahmer took the exact opposite approach, because Jeffrey Dahmer knew the things that he was doing was evil, and this is even the case in his trial, where he could have pled insanity but refused to, and actually asked for the death penalty and things like that, right? And so it shows John Wayne Gacy being given the death penalty, and his last thing is to tell people that they can kiss his rear end, with some a little bit more colorful language than that, right? And then he dies, and Jeffrey Dahmer ends up being killed by another prisoner in his prison. And the reason I think this is interesting is because you see that Dahmer has a genuine, like, second born again moment in his life. And for Christians, that's really, he is probably one of the best. I mean, I don't think he'll be remembered long after we're gone, because people, he's kind of a pop culture kind of guy. People who are into this stuff will remember him, but most people, he's going to leave the public consciousness, I think. And I think it's really interesting because he is the best test case for a lot of people when it comes to how deep do you think God's mercy goes. And this is where it's going to get a little graphic. So again, I warned you before, not for kids. Because Jeffrey Dahmer, like, we can say someone's a serial killer, right? They kill people, and that's a really bad thing. But, like, when you actually look at what he does to people, right? It wasn't just that he killed people, right? That's actually more like the Son of Sam. He would just go around and shoot people and then run away, right? Jeffrey Dahmer would bring men and young boys, the youngest of his victims was 14, to his apartment, where he would drug them and then kill them and then cut up their body parts after sometimes having sex with their corpses, cut up their body parts and cook them and eat them, and then sometimes have sex with the body parts, okay? And I think that's really obviously something that is revolting and disgusting and is the epitome of sexual sin. I think, like, if you want to go as far as you can to say things outside of God's purpose for sexuality, that's it. Not even to throw in the murder, right? Which is obviously also an incredibly evil thing because you're killing someone who's the image of God. Um, and so Jeffrey Dahmer, though, at the end of his life, and it's not like he was necessarily conscious that he was going to die soon, but while he's in prison, repents and is baptized, right? And it shows it in the show, and there's nothing in his own personal life that would just, unlike John Wayne Gacy, to say that he wouldn't really believe what he thought, right? It really seemed like he believed it. And if that is true, and we are to take what is given to us in the Bible, then we are to believe that Jeffrey Dahmer is in heaven, even though he has done all of these terrible and evil and disgusting sinful acts, right? And the show actually has him talk with a chaplain at the prison, and the chaplain brings up how, Jesus didn't die alone. Jesus died with two criminals, and one of them was a guy who mocked him, and the other one was someone who believed in him. And Jesus didn't, ask him what he did. He didn't say, you have to do such and such a thing. All that guy did is say, this is, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus says, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise, right? And that is a powerful thing as someone who's done prison ministry. That's a really powerful image, especially for people who are in prison. But for anyone who is definitely within society committed a heinous sin, an amazing thing to tell them, and that's what sets Jeffrey Dahmer on the path. Now, is that what actually happened? I don't know. I haven't read any books or anything like that, but it seems like that is in some way something that Jeffrey Dahmer came to understand about himself. And so, with facts on the ground, it seems that Jeffrey Dahmer would be in heaven. And of course, that opens up all sorts of problems. Like, well, I wouldn't say they're problems, but questions, right? So, like, what about justice? So, what happens to what about what he did to all those people who he killed, right? What about what does that say about us? Does that mean God's grace is cheap because someone this evil is able to approach the throne of God because Christ interceded for them and they understood that? And I think that those are all really good questions and like maybe things to tackle in other videos, but in general, I think that it doesn't prove that God is unjust, right? Because the idea for Christians is that we need to see ourselves the way that Jeffrey Dahmer saw himself. And of course, at a societal level, we should very much be able to tell the difference between someone who does what he did and someone who steals a pack of gum from a supermarket. But either way, God sees us as just as depraved as everyone else, right? He doesn't see us as any better naturally than anyone else in terms of our morality. We have all fallen short. We have all sinned against him. We all deserve death like Jeffrey Dahmer did, but a lot of us don't want to admit that to ourselves. And I think that wasn't part of the show, but I think for a Christian who's watching it, that's a really important thing to struggle with and to think about. And I really want to emphasize that aspect of it and say that, hey, we really should care about these types of things. And Jeffrey Dahmer is continuing to be judged in this lifetime, even though he is in heaven, given the facts on the ground. That's what I would say. By his remembrance and what people think of him, right? He is a byword for evil. He's a byword for just depravity in general, right? And people shudder when they think about him. And that's a continual judgment on him and his legacy and the terrible fruits that he bore. But it just goes to show that even if you do those things, God can still redeem you. And I think that is a wonderful aspect of God's justice and God's mercy, where he can do that for all of us. And it's on us to see whether we believe that is something that he can really offer us. So a lot more to talk about. Could have been more succinct, so I apologize for that. But I just wanted to kind of get these thoughts out while it was still fresh in my mind. So I hope that you guys have a good rest of your Tuesday. I hope that doesn't ruin anyone's dinner or whatever. but I am I do think it's kind of an important thing to talk about when it comes to this type of stuff. So have a good rest of your Tuesday. I'll see you guys tomorrow for our Bible study and Thursday for mailbag. And yeah, peace out.